I might be the first cuckold in the history of screwed-up matrimony to actually send his wife's lover a thank you card. Honestly, I really did. I'm almost never sick, but there was a particularly nasty strain of flu going around the office where I was working one Thursday morning, and I was showing the symptoms rather vocally. So, rather than infect the whole room, my boss sent me home. It was around noon, and I figured my wife, Beth, could nurse me properly, get me the chicken soup I needed, take my temperature, and generally fuss over me before putting me to bed. When I pulled onto the street where I lived and approached my house, I noticed a green pickup truck parked in the driveway. I really didn't think anything of it at that particular moment. I couldn't think of anything except how awful I felt. The vehicle wasn't familiar, and since it was taking up space where my beat-up SUV normally sat, I parked by the curb. I went in through the garage, which opened into the kitchen. There was no sign of Beth in the kitchen or the front den. At that point, a queasy feeling unrelated to the flu began to build in my gut, especially when I approached the back of the house where our bedroom was located and began to hear the telltale sounds of sex. I tiptoed toward the door, which was cracked ever so slightly, and peeked in. Well, of course, I saw Beth on her hands and knees with some slim guy I'd never seen before kneeling behind her, screwing her for all he was worth. And was she ever loving it? "Oh God, screw me," she wailed. "Come on, give it to me." The man grunted incoherently. I was looking at them from behind, and they were so wrapped up in what they were doing that they didn't see the door crack open. My reaction was strange. Part of me obviously wanted to go in there and break up their party, but another part of me was just numb. I should say here and now that I was not aroused. When you love someone for as long as I loved Beth, the sight of that person cheating on you is not a turn-on if you're wired normally. And I was and always had been a person who took fidelity seriously. In the space of a heartbeat, the time it took Beth and her boyfriend to come violently, I had an epiphany, a moment of clarity when my future suddenly spread out before my eyes. I made a decision in that moment that my life was changing for the better. I took out my cell phone, pushed the door open, raised the phone with the camera mode on, and took about 4 really good pictures of the startled lovers. Having gotten visual evidence of my wife's adultery and that of her lover, I turned on my heel and walked briskly out of the house the same way I had entered. I stopped and grabbed a screwdriver on my way out of the garage, then casually used it to poke large holes in 2 of the tires on the jerk's truck. I know it was childish, but it was the least I could do. Then I got in my SUV and drove off, though not before jotting down the license plate number of the pickup. It was the first day of the rest of my life. As I drove more or less aimlessly, I thought about what I'd just seen and realized that it had been brewing for a long time. I had no idea how long Beth had been cheating on me, whether this guy was the first or just another in a string. It didn't matter because, truthfully, I didn't care. I guess at this point, a little background is in order. My name is Peter Thornhill, and at the time of this story, I was 48 years old and had been married to Beth for exactly half that time. At one point, we were passionately in love. Indeed, it was almost love at first sight. We met not long after I graduated from college and started with a major manufacturing company located in a mid-sized Midwestern city. I had been raised in western Nebraska, and I had hoped to find something closer to the mountains where I had camped just about every year as a kid. Beth was from the city where we had lived the entirety of our married life. I honestly can't pin down when my marriage turned. It was a very long, very slow decline that wouldn't have been noticeable to the outsider, but it was there, and I could sense it. Toward the end, we all have dreams, and mine was to live in the mountains and write the great American novel. I think Beth's big dream was simply to land a husband and raise a family there in her hometown. You know how dreams usually go. They fall apart on the rocky shores of reality. The reality for me was that I ended up stuck in this nondescript Midwestern burg, writing computer programs for the same company I'd started with after college. I got to a certain point on the corporate ladder, and then got lost as more ambitious men and women passed me by. Part of my problem was that I wouldn't cut corners. I was a perfectionist where my work was concerned, and I didn't suffer fools who took the easy way out. Another part of my problem was that I became so good at my particular job that I was indispensable in that position. As a result, I got passed over for promotions, although I did receive regular raises and occasional bonuses. But the other part of my problem was that I had a fairly passive personality. I was content to go along to get along, and that extended to my marriage. Don't get me wrong, Beth was a nice-looking woman with dark brown hair and an ample figure, and I had always loved her. She never quite lost all of the weight she gained having our 2 children, but I still thought she was sexy, apparently. So did someone else. We bought a house not long after we were married. It was in a decent neighborhood, but certainly not the high-rent district. The house was built in the 1960s, and some of the things in it hadn't been replaced in all that time. So we gradually replaced one appliance after another, with no particular rhyme or reason. We were always fixing this and patching that. We always talked about buying something better, but after refinancing the mortgage as collateral for loans a couple of times, we found we had priced ourselves out of any chance of selling it. In other words, what it would have taken to pay off the loan and get something better was more than the house was really worth. We could have sold it for less to someone as a fixer-upper, but that still wouldn't have solved the problem of finding someplace better to live that we could afford. Then there was the problem with our children. 3 years into our marriage, we had a son, Jason. 4 years later came a girl, Laura. These kids were the poster children for why adults in the animal kingdom sometimes eat their young. I tried to be a disciplinarian as much as I could, but Beth's idea of discipline was to give them whatever they wanted, and she refused to let me spank them for any infraction whatsoever. The consequences were pretty drastic. Jason was lazy, disrespectful, and slovenly. Laura was a neurotic nymphomaniac. They learned at an early age how to play Beth and me against each other to get what they wanted, and as a result, we lost control of them. By the time they became teenagers, Jason was about to lose his 6th minimum wage job, since he barely graduated from high school. It seems employers like for their workers to show up on time and in reasonably presentable attire. They're funny that way. He was living in a dumpy old house in town with 3 of his slacker buddies, and I was pretty sure he was at the very least smoking pot and drinking a lot. Laura was about to flunk out of high school altogether because she couldn't keep the MP3 player out of her ears long enough to pay attention to anything in class. She was also dating some scuzzy college guy with tattoos all up and down both arms. Beth was a nurse who eventually decided she preferred working the night shift. On the days she worked, I would get home around 5:30, and sometimes we'd have dinner together before she left for work around 6:15. Due to our conflicting schedules, we began spending less time together, and our intimacy dwindled. We would connect physically once or twice a month, typically on a weekend afternoon when she was off. It was always okay. There's no such thing as bad intimacy, but it was fairly routine. We'd go through the motions with me taking the lead, and it would usually end quickly. Occasionally, Beth would be in the mood and take the initiative, but those moments became increasingly rare. Things were relatively stable until about 18 months before this particular incident, when Beth's mood began to shift. She had always been a bit temperamental, but menopause seemed to hit her hard. She started finding reasons to avoid intimacy, at least with me, citing headaches, tiredness, or going to bed much earlier than I was ready for. Along with this, she began to criticize more often, finding fault in things I did or didn't do. Looking back on it, the signs were there. I just didn't see them. I'd sometimes call the house during the days when I knew Beth should have been up and around, and I'd get no answer. Sometimes she'd stop in for drinks with some coworkers at an all-night bar that catered to night shift workers. A few times, she'd come home on weekends when she'd worked and immediately start a load of laundry like she had something she wanted to wash before I could see it. Everything pointed to Beth's adultery, but like I said, it really didn't matter. So, let's review. I was stuck in a dead-end job in a nowhere town. I was living in a rundown house that was overpriced. My sex life was in the toilet. My witchy wife was cheating on me. And my children were budding delinquents. What would you do? Probably what I did. Actually, the very first thing I did was go to the walk-in clinic to see about my flu. I got a steroid shot and a prescription for an antibiotic. Feeling a little better, I went to Walmart to have my prescription filled and to buy some things I needed: toiletries, a hot plate, a small pot, some soup, and sodas. Then I drove all the way across town and got a motel room. I had stopped at the bank on my way to Walmart and withdrawn some cash to pay for a place to stay for a couple of days. Once I got settled in, I sat down and wrote out a game plan for the next few days while I heated a can of soup. I ate as much as I could, put the rest in the mini refrigerator, crawled into bed, and crashed. It was dark when I awoke, and I was a little disoriented until I remembered where I was and why I was there. I was still weak from the flu, and really I was too dazed by my illness and the shock of seeing Beth like that to fully absorb what had happened. I heated up what was left of the soup, drank a Sprite, and watched a football game on TV before going back to bed. I did check my cell phone and saw a dozen calls from Beth. I smiled grimly at that. Let her sweat, I thought. I woke up the next morning feeling quite a bit better. The first thing I did was call the office to tell them I wasn't going to be into work. My boss's secretary answered the phone, and after I explained why I was calling, she told me that Beth had called all afternoon looking for me. She did she? I said, if she calls today, and I imagine she will, just tell her I've called in sick and won't be in today. That'll at least get her off your back. Pete, where are you? She asked. Let me put it this way and see if you can figure it out. I said, I'm not at my house. Okay then, she said, and I hung up. I had made it very plain that I no longer had a home. I had thought a lot about my course of action, and the more I thought about it, the better I liked it. I really couldn't be mad at Beth. It was pretty obvious that she didn't want to be married to me any longer. For some reason, she wanted something I couldn't give her, whatever that was, and I wasn't going to hold her back from whatever it was that she wanted. She wanted to screw other men. Fine, I'd give her the freedom to do so and free myself in the process. But I still had some work to do. There were going to be consequences for both Beth and her lover. Nothing terribly drastic, but consequences nonetheless. The first thing I did was call the motor vehicle department to inquire about buying a pickup truck. I'd lost the owner's phone number, but I had the license plate number, as well as the make, model, and color of the truck. The friendly woman on the other end of the line cheerfully gave me the man's name and address. My next move was to call a friend of mine who was a lawyer and get the name of the best divorce attorney in town. I called that worthy, a lady as it happened, and scheduled an appointment for 1 o'clock that afternoon. I showered, then went down to the lobby for a very light breakfast before heading to the bank. I had 2 certificates of deposit that I had bought a number of years earlier. I cashed those in, withdrew half of the money from our joint savings account, and half of what little there was in the checking account. I put most of the money into a new checking account that I opened in my name only, along with a bank debit card. I walked out with a little over $4,000 in traveler's checks. I spent the next few minutes calling credit card companies to cancel all but one of my cards and have the accounts put in my name only. I also paid off the balances on each of those cards. The one I generously left for Beth, I didn't bother paying off. Let her worry about that one. Next, I went to a branch of the public library where I bought some computer time. I took the 4 images I'd taken on my cell phone, downloaded them onto an email address I had, and printed out 2 copies of each one. I have to admit they were very clear and explicit. Then I looked up information on the fellow who'd been with my wife the previous afternoon, one Clark Slater. I found out he was married, so I jotted down his wife's name. I then put a copy of the pictures with the note attached, letting her know where I could be reached for more information, into an envelope with her name and address on it. I went to the post office, bought some stamps, and mailed it to her. Then it was time for my appointment with Grace Shaw, the attorney. I told her what I'd done and what my plans were, and she just nodded her head. When I showed her the pictures, her first question, however, was one of caution. "Divorce seems like a pretty drastic step on such short notice," she said. "Are you sure you don't want to try to work it out?" "What's there to work out?" I said. "My wife has a lover, and I don't want to stand in the way of true love. I have some places I want to go, and some things I want to do with my life. And staying here with a cheating wife isn't part of those plans." In the end, I agreed to a legal separation for 90 days. The divorce papers were drawn up, and if after 3 months I was still determined to end my marriage, then the papers would be filed, and Beth would be served. "Now, if you go forward with the divorce, what sort of settlement do you want?" Grace asked. "I've already taken half of the liquid cash in our bank," I said. "She's got a 403B that she's paying into from her work. She can keep that, but she also doesn't get any of my 401K either. She can keep the house. The mortgage is in her name anyway, and I don't want it. If she does sell it, though, I want half of all proceeds from the sale." "Okay, Mr. Thornhill, I guess that about covers it," Grace said. "I'll look forward to hearing from you in about 3 months." My last stop was to the office, but not to work. I walked into the Human Resources Department and asked about what would be involved in taking early retirement. I had 26 years with the company, so I had a good bit of retirement built up. I was told I could begin drawing on my retirement pension when I turned 60, which was 12 years away. I frowned at that but brightened when I asked about cashing in my 401K. Of course, the lady at HR strongly discouraged that because of the hefty tax penalty I'd have to pay. Nevertheless, if I wanted, I could get an immediate cash out of approximately $65,000. I thanked the lady and headed back to my motel. I was tired, and after fixing another pot of chicken soup, I went to bed and slept for nearly 7 hours. It was after midnight when I awoke, and I knew I now faced the hardest part of my day, going back to the house and collecting my things. Beth was supposed to be at work, but I wasn't sure if she'd actually gone in. As it turned out, she hadn't. Beth was asleep when I slipped in quietly, and the house was silent. Apparently, Laura was so concerned about my whereabouts that she'd gone out, like she always did on Friday nights. I wondered if the kids would even miss me when I was gone. Probably not. The first thing I did was get what I needed out of the garage: tools, camping gear, and other assorted useful items. I went into the little office area and got my laptop. I plugged it in and downloaded some files from the home PC onto the laptop, then carried it to my vehicle. I had a couple of boxes with me that I loaded with CDs, a portable player, a lot of books, and some mementos that meant something to me, including a few pictures, though none of Beth. After I loaded that stuff into my vehicle, I got some suitcases out and walked softly into my former bedroom. I was about halfway finished with packing when I heard a small gasp behind me, and then Beth's voice. "Peter, where have you been?" she said. "I've been worried sick about you." "Have you now?" I said, trying to keep the anger out of my voice. "What are you doing, Beth?" she said. "What's it look like I'm doing?" "Packing," I answered sarcastically. "Packing?" Beth said in a trembling voice. "Give that girl a gold star for brilliance," I said. "Peter, I'm so sorry," she began. When I stopped her, I said, "Beth, I don't want to hear your excuses or your apologies. It really doesn't matter why or how or even who, although I do know that much. You want to love someone else. Fine, I'm letting you. But I don't love him. I don't want him," she began. "I love you. I don't want him. I want you." "Could have fooled me," I said in an acidic tone. "It sounded to me like you wanted him pretty badly yesterday afternoon. Let me see if I can recall the exact words. Oh God, screw me. Isn't that about it?" Beth just buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. I looked at her evenly. Whatever brief flash of anger I'd had was gone, replaced by, I'm not sure, pity. No, Not that. Disdain. Maybe a little. Disgust. Yeah, a bit. But mainly, I realized that the biggest thing I was feeling was emptiness. I realized in that moment that I didn't have any feelings for her whatsoever. I just didn't care anymore. I finished packing and let her sob into her pillow. It wasn't until I started up the bedroom door with the suitcases that she jumped off the bed and tried to stop me. "Wait," Beth cried. "Don't leave me. Pete, please, can't we work this out? Please, I'm sorry. It wasn't anything. It was just sex." I just stared at her silently as I carefully extricated myself from her clinging arms and walked to the front of the house. Beth followed me, sobbing hysterically. I pointed out the notice of legal separation sitting on the kitchen table among the dirty remnants of that night's pizza dinner. "I'll be back in 3 months, mid-December," I said. "If I'm still thinking then like I am now, I'm following through on a divorce. I will let you know generally where I am. But I'm leaving, and I'm not sure yet where I'm going to be. Goodbye, Beth. I'll see you around." "Pete, no," Beth cried as I walked out the front door with my suitcases. I didn't look back as I climbed into my vehicle and headed back across town to my motel room. The next day was Saturday, so I slept in. When I got going, I packed up what I had in the motel room and checked out. At $85 a night, the motel was a little steep, and there was a place near my office that catered to visiting business people. They had long-term rates that were considerably cheaper than the average motel. For approximately $45 a night, I rented a clean room for 2 weeks that had a nice little kitchenette, internet, cable access, and a large television with pay-per-view porn movies, if I was so inclined. I did sample the sexy worst being offered on the TV, but mostly I kicked back and indulged in football all weekend, doing absolutely nothing else. Then I went to work the next Monday morning. The first thing I did was walk into my boss's office and hand him my letter of resignation, effective in 2 weeks. Needless to say, everyone at the office was stunned. I'd been there so long and in the same job that I guess I'd become part of the landscape. My boss, for one, was in a panic. He spent the whole 2 weeks trying to talk me out of retiring, but I was adamant. On Tuesday of the first week, I got a call from my daughter. It was a rather enlightening conversation. "Daddy, why are you leaving us?" Laura asked. "You'll have to ask your mother that," I replied. "She said to ask you," Laura said. "Okay," I said. Thursday afternoon, I caught her in bed with some other man. I was sick with the flu, took off work early, and there she was. I've got the pictures to prove it. "Wow," Laura said. "I didn't think she had it in her." "Well, that explains why she's been so weepy. Daddy, she's a basket case. She just sits around crying and cursing herself. You know, she called in sick all 3 days this weekend." "Look, tell your mother to get a grip on herself," I said through clenched teeth. "If she thinks she can guilt-trip me into coming back to her, she's very mistaken. I've already put in for my retirement, and a week from Saturday, I'm out of here. After that, what she does, what you do, and what your derelict brother does are none of my concern." "Well, I love you too, Dad," Laura cried. "Hey, you never gave a flying fig about me before. Now, why should you start now?" I said. "You're just afraid the gravy train's fixing to roll out of the station." "That's not true," Laura said a little pensively. "I need you. You're the only one in this house with any sense, and I don't know what's going to happen without you." "Oh, I'm sure you'll manage," I said. "Look, Laura, I'm sorry about what I said. That was mean of me. I'll be in touch, and I'll be home for Christmas, okay?" "I love you, really," she said. "I know, Daddy," she said with a sniffle. "I love you too." Jason never did call. I had a pretty busy 2 weeks. Beth tried to call any number of times, but after I hung up on her a few times, she got the message that I didn't want to talk to her. Her friends from work tried to get me to at least see her, but I refused, and I said so in pretty harsh terms. It turns out Clark Slater was a nurse up in the unit where Beth worked, and they'd been seeing each other for about 6 months. Most everyone I talked to said they thought he was the only one she'd stepped out on me with, but they didn't know for sure. I very pointedly told all of them how much I appreciated them telling me what my wife was doing behind my back. They didn't have much to say after that. I got a call in the middle of the first week from Clark Slater's wife. Apparently, Beth wasn't the first nurse, married or otherwise, he'd been able to tap, but Beth was going to be the last, at least while he was her husband. I had finally given her the solid proof she needed to show him the door. Funny, but I never heard from Clark either about Beth or his ruined tires. I had an awful lot to do before I left my work behind. I had to train someone who could handle my job until they hired a full-time replacement. I had to get my 12-year-old vehicle serviced. I had to scout around for a broker who could set up my 401k in a private account, and I had to get with HR about my severance pay and cashing in my remaining sick time. I spent most of my downtime watching TV, fooling around on my laptop, or shopping for things I would need when I left town. I also visited a few of my friends, all of whom expressed their disbelief that Beth really would cheat on me. All too soon, the second Friday arrived, my last day of work, and with it came a little sense of regret. I'd put in 26 years at that company, and I'd made a lot of friends there. At lunch that day, my boss called our department together, and we had a little retirement party. That's when I finally lost my composure. I was trying to give a thank you speech when I suddenly broke down and cried. The first time I'd cried over anything in years. I wept both because I was leaving and because of the circumstances that had driven me to my decision to retire. I had kept myself so busy over the previous 2 weeks that I hadn't given myself a chance to let out the emotions over Beth's cheating, and seeing my colleagues gathered in my honor was just too much for me to overcome. But I got over it pretty quickly, especially when Marcy Glover came over to me and invited me to an after-work gathering with a few of them at Chili's. Of course I said yes, even though I made it clear that I don't drink. Marcy was a fellow computer geek, but she was a damn good-looking geek. She was in her early 30s, a tall blonde divorcee with a 10-year-old daughter who was spending the weekend with her father. As she told me that, she gave me a very smoky look. I'll admit that kind of confused me. I mean, I'm not bad-looking. In fact, I look considerably younger than my years, but a stud muffin I'm not, or at least I didn't think I was. I'm a little shorter than average, about 5 feet 9 inches. I wear glasses, I have a little bit of a belly, and while I'm no weakling, I'm no fitness freak either. But I was about to find out that I had more sex appeal than I'd ever imagined. There was a group of 7, 3 women and 2 men, besides Marcy and myself, and for once in my life, I was the man of the hour. We sat for several hours drinking beer. Well, I had tea, and told stories about the plant, the town, and each other. In the midst of the festivities, we also took time to have dinner. As the night wore on, I was sitting next to Marcy, and it became rather obvious that she was coming on to me. She was sitting real close, putting her hand on my thigh or on my arm. I couldn't decide whether she was just doing that because she was drunk or whether she was serious. Finally, about 9 o'clock, we started drifting our separate ways. I wanted to get an early start the next day and got up to leave. Then I looked over at Marcy and saw that she really shouldn't drive home, so I offered her a ride. After getting hugs and handshakes wishing me well, I walked Marcy out to my car. When we got in, she moved in real close to me, put her hand on my thigh, and gave me a penetrating look. "I'm really not all that drunk," Marcy said. "I just wanted you to give me a ride, and not home either." "So where do you want me to take you?" I said, deliberately playing dumb. "Take me to your motel," she said, and she pulled my face around and kissed me hard and deep. "Marcy, you don't have to do this," I said when we broke apart. "I mean, yeah, I'm lonely, but I don't want any sympathy." "Sympathy's got nothing to do with it," she said. "Pete, I've had the hots for you ever since I started working there, and I've finally got a chance. I'm not passing it up." "You've had the hots for me," I said. "Come on, Marcy, look at me. I'm a fat, gray-haired old man." "In the first place, you're not fat," she said. "In the second place, your hair makes you look sexy. In the third place, you're very good-looking. And in the fourth place, you're one of the nicest men I know. You're one of the few men in that building who's never made a pass at me, or any of the other gals, for that matter. Trust me, we've noticed. You've always been a gentleman." "I've always been a married gentleman," I said with just a trace of bitterness. "Look, you're going off tomorrow, and you deserve some TLC before you go," Marcy said. "Now, are you going to take me back to your motel and screw me or not?" I laughed then and started up my vehicle. The truth is, I'd had many fantasies about Marcy Glover, but I always figured she was out of my league. Besides, I was a married man who believed in fidelity. Technically, I guess I was still married, but I was already legally separated, and in my heart, I knew my marriage was over. Marcy Glover was offering me her body, and I'd be damned if I was going to pass it up. As soon as the door to my room closed, we were instantly drawn to each other, kissing passionately, our hands exploring one another. It wasn't long before I found myself admiring Marcy's slender figure as she sat back on the bed. Her presence was captivating. I was ready for the moment. It had been over a week since I had any real release, so I was eager for what was to come. This experience felt different, though. Marcy was much more engaged than I had been used to, at least in my previous experiences. We held each other close, moving together in harmony, each of us focused on the other's pleasure. I could see the anticipation building on Marcy's face as she approached another peak of satisfaction. I leaned back on the bed, watching as Marcy sat up and carefully adjusted herself for what was to come next. "Thanks," I said. "Beth would never let me do that. She thought it was demeaning." "I can see where some women might think that," Marcy said. "Personally, I love it." We lay back on the bed and rested. Then I made love to her again, this time a little more leisurely. After that, we fell asleep together. We made love one final time with the pale light of dawn filtering through the drapes. Then we got up, showered, and dressed. Marcy helped me pack. Then I checked out and drove her back to where her car was parked. Before she left, she gave me a very soft kiss and then stared into my eyes. "Pete, all I can say is your wife's an idiot," she said. "She doesn't know what she's thrown away." "Well, I guess sometimes you get used to someone and get in a rut," I said. "I probably let things slide too much from my side. You know how it goes." "Yeah, I guess I do," Marcy said. "Pete, I hope you find what you're looking for. But if you ever decide to come back here for any length of time, look me up. I guarantee I'll treat you a hell of a lot better than Beth did." "Thanks, Marcy," I said. "I'll stay in touch. You never know what's going to happen. You take care, okay?" "You too," she said. "You be careful." With that, I was off. I put my vehicle on the interstate, headed west, and didn't look back. I was off alone to travel the country with no plans, no itinerary, no agenda. I had some places out west I wanted to see, some things I wanted to do, but I had no particular schedule. I would go wherever my nose led me. It was something I'd wanted to do for years, but had never been able to do. Either I couldn't afford it, I had family concerns, or work concerns. Now I had none of those things holding me back. My first destination, however, was my old hometown. I wanted to spend a few days with my folks, who were starting to get on in years, and I also wanted to see some old friends. I ended up seeing one I hadn't counted on, and it was a delightful experience. My parents were disappointed to hear that Beth and I were splitting up, but my mom also said she wasn't surprised. "She just hasn't seemed very happy the last few times you've been here," Mom said. The following Monday, I was in the supermarket picking up some supplies for my trip when I heard my name being called. I looked around, and a big smile creased my face as I saw a blast from my past. It was Dolores Valdez, a curvy woman I went to school with. She was actually a year behind me, but we always seemed to have a class or two together every year, and we got to be friendly. At the time, Dolores was a hot number who was a little too fast for me, But time had slowed her down a bit. She had learned the hard way that the fast life wasn't always the good life, but time had still been generous to her because she was still a stone beauty. If anything, age had made her better looking than when she was in high school, softening her features and adding a little padding in strategic places. She was a little shorter than average, with thick dark hair and expressive brown eyes. Of course, her figure was still sexy. She had moved back to town after divorcing her second husband and was an assistant manager at the store. She lived alone in a small house in a quiet neighborhood not far from her daughter's family. We chatted for a few minutes, catching up on our lives. When I told her I was divorcing my wife, her eyes lit up. "I'm off tomorrow," she said in an inviting tone. "How would you like to have dinner with me?" "I'd love to," I said. "Any place in particular?" "How about my place?" she said. "It's been a while since I fixed dinner for a man, especially an old friend like you." I arrived at Dolores' place about 7 the next night to find her dressed in a tight red dress with spaghetti straps and her face quite tastefully made up. My younger brother, who lives nearby, had given me a Viagra pill when I told him who I was seeing. He said I was going to need it, and it looked like he was right. I entered her small but tidy little house and was greeted by the aroma of enchiladas cooking in the oven and other assorted Mexican treats being prepared for dinner. I was about to discover that Dolores was a terrific cook, but I also learned that she was a skilled conversationalist. While waiting for dinner to finish cooking, we sat in her living room, real close, and got caught up with each other's lives. She was very understanding about what had happened to me, and also about what had happened to Beth. Dolores had wrecked her first marriage by cheating, but her second marriage had fallen apart because her husband was cheating, so she was able to give me insights from both sides of the fence. It didn't make me feel any better about it, but it did help. Dinner was something special. Enchiladas, tostadas, rice, and the best flan I'd ever tasted in my life. "How do you stay as slim as you do when you cook like this?" I asked as I pushed my bloated belly away from the table. "Oh, I only cook like this on special occasions," Dolores said with a laugh. "If I ate like this every day, I'd be as wide as I am tall." We retired to the front room then and sat real close on the couch again. We talked for a bit, getting around to why she'd invited me over that night. "Because I wanted to do something I never got a chance to do when we were in high school," she said. "You were always so nice, so cute, so sexy, but I knew I could never have you then. Mama and Papa wouldn't have approved of me dating a white boy. You know, it's very ironic, very sad. They had no problem with me being with all these cholos and gangbangers as long as they were Mexican, but a nice white boy. Forget it. But you don't have that problem now, do you?" I said as I brought my face real close to hers. We kissed then, and I lost myself in her full lips and active tongue. Dolores was acting like a hungry woman, a woman who hadn't had any in a while, which amused me. She got a little teary when I asked her how long it had been since she had a man. "Too long," she said. "When I came back here, I made a vow that I wasn't going to let my past trip me into stupid relationships, but memories die hard in a small town. If I had $5 for every time I've been propositioned in the past year by somebody I went to school with, I wouldn't have to work. That's why this is so special for me. You never looked down on me back in the old days, and you'd have never made an improper advance if I hadn't invited you here. I know you wouldn't. Doesn't mean I wouldn't have thought it," I said with a chuckle. "Believe me, Dolores, I had a lot of fantasies in high school of imagining myself with you." For some reason, that just melted her. She whispered something in Spanish and then was all over me, kissing me deeply and working her hands over my body. She quickly got my sweater off and the t-shirt I had under it, then attacked my pants. In no time at all, I found myself on her sofa, and Dolores was standing in front of me, unzipping her dress. As it slipped to the floor, I couldn't help but admire her. The contrast between her dark hair and her pale skin was striking, especially with the garter belt, hosiery, and heels she still wore. I reached up, gently touching her as she leaned in to kiss me with urgency. "I want you," she said with desire, and I certainly wasn't going to disagree. I wanted her too. Hearing such words from a woman like Dolores, especially after my experience with Marcy, gave me a significant boost in confidence, reaffirming that I still had plenty to offer. Dolores kissed me passionately and whispered in my ear, expressing her desire for me to be close to her. Never let it be said that I don't give a hot woman what she wants. When I was satisfied, I lifted myself up, then collapsed onto her back and laughed in utter contentment. That moment was the first time I thought about thanking Clark Slater for setting the events in motion that had led me to that point. Thanks to Clark and his tawdry affair with my wife, I was free from my comfortable but boring life in a nowhere town, an increasingly loveless marriage, a chaotic family life in a decaying house, and a job that had long ceased to challenge me in a large corporation where I was lost in the shuffle. I was free to go anywhere, do anything, and be with anyone I wanted. I couldn't have done that with a clear conscience had I not caught my wife and her lover in the act of adultery. After catching our breath, Dolores and I retired to her oversized bathtub, one of the few extravagances she'd indulged in since returning to town, where we spent a long time bathing each other and kissing. We ended up making love again, right there in the bathtub, then moved to her bed and made love once more before we finally passed out from well-sated exhaustion. The next day, I spent time with my family. Then, I set out in earnest the following day. As I drove, I reflected that it had been exactly 3 weeks since I'd caught Beth and Clark. 3 weeks that had completely changed my life. This trip was the first step in living my new life. Over the next 3 months, I wandered the western half of the country, seeing places I had only read about. My first stop was Mount Rushmore, followed by a couple of days exploring the site of the Battle of Little Bighorn. I walked the grounds and communed with the ghosts of Custer and the 7th Cavalry, as well as Crazy Horse and his warriors. After that, I drove to Jackson Hole and camped out for a week and a half while touring Yellowstone and the Grand Tetons. I had to laugh when I got my first look at the Tetons, thinking that the French who named them must have been awfully hard up to see women's breasts in those jagged peaks. From there, I drove up to spend some time in northern Idaho, camping on the banks of Lake Penn Oriole. I had been there once before as a teenager at a Boy Scout jamboree in 1969. In fact, my fellow scouts and I were among the few Americans who didn't see the first moon landing because we were camped well away from televisions. While there, I fished the lake and hiked the trails, enjoying the cool mountains of the northern Rockies. When I woke one morning in late October to 3 inches of snow on the ground, I knew it was time to move on to more temperate climates. I went to Seattle, then down the Pacific coast through Oregon, to spend some time in the Napa Valley. Yes, I did sample some of the excellent wine the area produces before heading to Yosemite for several days. After that, I visited an aging aunt and uncle in the Los Angeles area, and achieved a long-held desire to see Southern Cal play UCLA in the Rose Bowl, one of the truly big rivalries in college football, at one of the most historic stadiums in the country. I also spent a day at the beach in Venice, getting an eyeful of all the California hardbodies that hang out there, wearing very little. While in a gift shop across the street from the beach, I saw a postcard and got the wicked idea of sending one to my wife and her lover. It showed 4 very noble, scantily clad women with the heading that read, "Greetings from Venice Beach." I wrote a note on each one, thanking them for screwing around on me so I could take this trip, then sent one to the house for Beth and one to the hospital for Clark. That was the weekend before Thanksgiving, and it was time for me to get to where I really wanted to go. My best friend from high school lived in Durango, Colorado, a beautiful mountain town not far from the Four Corners. He and his wife had started a small business and needed someone to help with computer marketing and other cyber-related tasks. It was perfect for me. He owned a small house that he'd been using as a rental property where I could stay, and he offered a flexible work schedule that would allow me the freedom to go wherever I wanted, whenever I wanted. I had spent a lot of spare time on the road doing a lot of writing, and had the makings of a pretty good book. I simply wrote about myself, my trip, and why I was doing it, along with other pertinent reflections. Once I completed my business with Beth and settled in Colorado, I'd have time to polish my work. It was all about the changes in a middle-aged life as a result of one disastrous event. I didn't know it that Monday when I headed east toward Colorado, but my life was about to change again in a completely unexpected way. I had been in Durango a couple of days when Chris, my friend Kyle's wife, announced that she had invited a friend of hers over to share Thanksgiving dinner with us. This woman lived alone, Chris said, and didn't socialize much. But Chris hated the thought of someone being alone on Thanksgiving, so she had extended the invitation, and it had been accepted. Funny how life pivots on little decisions like that. Maybe I would have met Maureen McDermott anyway once I moved to Durango, but who knows what might have happened in the interim. Perhaps she'd have decided to move on, or maybe someone else would have swooped in and swept her off her feet. I don't know. All I do know is that when Maureen walked through the door of Kyle and Chris's house, my stomach did a shimmy, and before the day was out, I was determined to make her mine. Maureen was a woman in her mid-30s, quite tall at nearly 6 feet, slender but not bony. She had a pale complexion peppered with freckles, flaming red hair cut very short, and soft green eyes that were an enchanting blend of mischief and sadness. When she spoke, it sounded like a symphony of leprechauns. Yes, she was a full-blooded native of Ireland who had come to the States with an Irish dance troupe, one of those river dance groups, and had settled in Denver. She had moved to Durango about a year earlier after breaking off an engagement 2 days before the wedding. It seemed she had caught her groom-to-be at his bachelor party in the act of screwing a stripper who had been hired for the night. She hadn't intended to crash his party, but she and a couple of her girlfriends had been on their way to breakfast after their own party when she happened to pass a strip club and saw her fiancé and his group coming out. One of the girls from the club was wrapped around her betrothed, and she decided to follow them to see what happened. It had been an emotionally scaring event, one more blow in a life that had seen plenty of them. Her father had been an alcoholic who beat her mother until they fled him when Maureen was 15. After he started beating on her, she said, her father stalked them relentlessly until the police finally stepped in, and he was charged and convicted of spousal abuse. She had subsequently been assaulted while on holiday in London when she was 22 and had her heart broken several times after that, culminating in her fiancé's cheating. I think the reason we hit it off so well was because we both understood what cheating was all about. Over the previous weeks of traveling, I had thought a lot about Beth and what she'd done, and I couldn't get past the inconsistency of her protestations of love for me with the image of her in bed with another man. She had cheated on me in our marriage, and I didn't have a clue as to why. I had been telling myself all along that I didn't care, but that wasn't entirely true. I did care. I wanted to know what had happened to the love we'd once shared, and why Beth felt she was entitled to take a lover on the side, knowing how I felt about fidelity. I did keep up with what was going on back home, mostly through emails to and from Laura, who seemed to have decided at this late date to repair our relationship. She was plainly worried about Jason, who had indeed lost his job, and was begging Beth to let him move back in. I spoke to Beth a couple of times briefly, but whenever she started to get weepy or tried to apologize, I cut her off. I did promise her that I would sit down and listen to her when I got back. It wasn't going to change anything, but I wanted to hear what she had to say. Nothing was going to change my mind. By then, I had made my decision on what I wanted, and I wanted to live in Durango. As a result, I spent 3 weeks getting settled in my new home and helping Kyle and Chris with their business. I was also spending a lot of time with Maureen. We talked long and deep on Thanksgiving night about everything, to Chris's amazement and delight. When I walked with her out to her car, we looked at each other and kissed. There wasn't a lot of passion in it, but there was a lot of promise. Over the 3 weeks I was there before returning home, or rather, my soon-to-be former home, we dated probably a dozen times and grew more intimate. I knew I had to be careful because of Morin's past. She had been hurt badly by men and was wary of being hurt again. But the more I got to know her, the more I realized that despite her history, she was a woman with a hot-blooded nature. She was a dynamite kisser with lips that were just full enough to enjoy and a tongue that knew what it was doing. Waiting was excruciating because the more time I spent with Morin, the more I wanted her. She was so sexy, so sensual, and yes, so needy, but I understood her need to be cautious and respected her desire to take it slow. My patience was rewarded the weekend before I was scheduled to head back to finish my business with Beth. Kyle and Chris wanted me to get a real taste of Colorado, so they planned a 4-day ski trip. There's a nice ski resort right outside Durango, and Purgatory is really close, but they wanted me to enjoy the whole ski experience. They pulled some strings with a friend of theirs in the real estate business who helped us get a nice 2-bedroom condo in Telluride, about 70 miles away. I was having dinner with Morin one night, a few days before we were to leave when the subject of the trip came up, and she asked what she should bring. I just kind of stared at her, and she gave me a Mona Lisa smile. "You knew I was going, didn't you?" she said. "I was hoping, but I didn't know if it was my place to invite you or not." I said, "You know, the condo only has 2 bedrooms, and that's a problem." "How?" she said, smiling a little wider. "Are you sure?" I said, taking her hands and looking deep into her eyes. "Very sure," she said. "I knew you were the one I'd been looking for all my life. The first time I met you, I knew. You know your heart. You're a good man, Pete, and you deserve to be happy. I think I can make you happy." Did she ever? We drove up to Telluride on a cold, clear Thursday morning. The early winter snows had been heavy in the high country, so we figured the skiing would be good, and it was. I had been skiing once before, a long time ago, when a group of us from college spent a week at Vail. Morin had been skiing once before, a long time ago, when a group of us from college spent a week at Vail. Morin had been skiing once before as well, the previous season, with Kyle and Chris. Despite that limited experience, Morin and I took the 1-day ski school that was recommended before we tackled the slopes on our own. Once we'd been taught the basics, she and I had a blast going up and down the mountain. We prudently stayed away from the black slopes, the expert trails, but we did try a few of the blue trails, the intermediate slopes, and found we could handle them with a fair bit of skill. It was bracing to spend time on the mountain with a woman I had come to care about quite intensely. I wasn't sure yet if I was in love or if she was in love with me, but we liked each other a lot and were comfortable in each other's company. We ended that first day sore and tired, but it was the good kind of soreness and the pleasant tiredness that comes from having a lot of fun. The 4 of us ended up at a nice, modestly priced restaurant for our post-ski dinner, and we toasted our rapidly cementing partnership in every sense of the word. When we got back to the condo, I showered and then sat back on the large water with a book I'd been reading while Morin took a long bath. I was toying with the idea of joining her, but decided not to be pushy. I wanted her to make the first move. I'm glad I did. She came into the bedroom smelling like peach blossoms, clad in a long, moderately heavy robe. She stood just inside the door and smiled at me. Slowly, she undid the sash of the robe and let the sides fall open. "See anything you like," she said, her soft Irish brogue sounding ever so sexy. I just nodded as I feasted my eyes on Morin's tall, trim body. I rolled off the bed and approached her, my hands gently caressing her as we came together, sharing a slow, smoldering kiss that grew in intensity. It felt like we were in a dream, as I softly ran my hands over her body while she removed my t-shirt and lowered my pants. We moved to the bed and lay down, our bodies naturally coming together. Our hands found each other, and unlike my previous encounters, there was no urgency, just a sense that we had all the time in the world to explore and cherish each other. We kissed again, and this time, when we pulled apart, Morin gently pushed me onto my back and began a slow, sensual journey down my neck to my chest. Her touch was so deliberate, so intimate that it drove me to the edge. I wanted to love this woman completely. We kissed again, this time with more passion. I gently rolled her onto her back. The sight of Morin McDermott, waiting expectantly, is something I'll never forget. She lay back on the bed, her eyes filled with desire. As I began to make love to her, I took my time, wanting us to reach that moment together. We clung to each other, kissing wildly, and it felt like we would never stop. But eventually, we did, and we slumped together in contented exhaustion, letting out a collective sigh. Morin and I laughed softly, contentedly, as we slowly came down from the peak of our shared pleasure. We held each other and gradually drifted off to sleep, spending the first of what I hoped would be thousands of nights together. The whole trip went like that. We tried just about every non-black slope on the mountain, explored the shops and cafes of downtown Telluride, and made love every night after we got back to the condo. By the time we returned to Durango, we knew it was love. On the Tuesday before Christmas, I packed my SUV with a few suitcases and presents for everyone, then headed back east for a few weeks. I went by way of my folks' house but didn't linger. I did visit Dolores to give her a present, but I didn't sleep with her. I told her I'd found someone in Colorado that I wanted to commit to, and she smiled as she said she understood. "I'd have expected nothing less from you," she said. Marcy Glover was much the same way. When I got back to town and called her up for dinner, I knew it wouldn't take long for someone to find you, she said. "You're too good a man to stay single very long. I'm glad you're happy." I did not stay at the house when I went back. It wasn't home anymore, and I didn't want to give Beth any illusions. I did visit quite a bit, and it was cordial enough, but she and I avoided the elephant in the room until after Christmas. It actually wasn't a bad Christmas. Jason had convinced Beth to let him move back home, but she finally grew a backbone where he was concerned. He could stay, but he had to pull his weight around the house. He'd come dangerously close to some serious drug trouble when he was living with his buddies, and apparently it had scared some sense into him because he was talking seriously about entering a rehab program. Laura had really taken my departure as a warning shot. She ditched the scuzzy boyfriend and was taking more interest in school, figuring out, as I had told her repeatedly in our email exchanges, that without at least a high school diploma, her odds of getting anywhere in life were about nil. She had gotten a part-time job at a youth-oriented novelty shop in the mall, where her quirky dress and hipster attitude were put to good use. The day after Christmas, Laura was at work, and I gave Jason $50 and told him to go have fun at the mall. Beth and I had serious business to discuss and needed to be alone. I brought the divorce petition that I'd gotten from Grace Shaw and set it on the coffee table in the front room. Beth just stared at it with sad eyes brimming with tears. "I guess you've made your decision," she said. "I have," I replied, "but I think I deserve some answers first. Why did you cheat on me, Beth? I know we had problems in our marriage, but if you'd been open about it, we might have worked through those problems." "I don't know," she said. "I guess I expected you to fight for me, fight for our marriage. If there was a competitor for my affections, I thought you'd do what you had to do. It just went too far. I was drinking a lot during that time, but that's no excuse. I let it happen, thinking that I could, I don't know, have this little fling and get that itch out of my system. I really didn't think you'd give up on us that easily." "What was there to fight for?" I said softly. "You were nagging all the time. Jason was one step away from jail. Laura was a teenage mother waiting to happen. The house was a wreck. Work was boring. And then you started cheating on me. Honestly, what was there to fight for? And that still doesn't answer the question of why you decided to be with another man behind my back and then kept seeing him for 6 months. That's something I just can't get my mind around." "A new experience," Beth said. "It was a jolt of excitement in a boring life. I guess I just needed something more. But Pete, you have to believe me. I've never stopped loving you. You were always the #1 man in my life, and you always will be." "I don't doubt that," I said, Although I'm having some trouble believing you loved me when you were entertaining Clark, especially when you were finding excuses not to be intimate with me. I may have been the #1 man in your life, like you say, but you were still paying a lot of attention to #2. I'm so sorry about all of that, she said in a very small voice. I guess I lost track of what was really important. So, do you hate me then? No, of course not, I said. We had 24 years together, and a lot of them were good years. You're the mother of my children, bless their hearts, and I think, in the main, you're a decent person who got confused and made a costly mistake. No, I don't hate you, Beth, but I don't love you anymore. That died the day I walked in on you and your lover. Maybe we just drifted apart, and Clark saw an opening. Actually, I owe you my thanks. What you did provided the spark that allowed me to have a new life, doing things I always wanted to do in places I always wanted to be. Well, it certainly agrees with you, she said. You look great. You do deserve to be happy, I guess. And I guess I deserve to be miserable, don't I? I watched Beth finally lose her composure. I didn't want to, but I went to her then and held her one last time, letting her cry. After she calmed down, she signed the divorce agreement. Since we were in a no-fault state, and we were divorcing on the nebulous grounds of irreconcilable differences, the divorce would be final after 60 days. I stayed a couple more days to pack up the rest of my things and to visit with the kids. I was still worried about Jason, but it looked like Laura was going to be all right. She had found her niche in retail sales and seemed to have gained a newfound respect for me. On the next to last day of the year, I said my final goodbyes and headed off to settle in Durango for good. That was 3 years ago. Kyle's business started to take off in that time, and I found the variety of tasks I was asked to perform quite stimulating. I spent a lot of time polishing up my book, and when I had what I believed was a finished product, I started shopping it around to publishers. I had to endure a half-dozen rejections before I found one that liked it. The book received some nice reviews and managed to make the lower end of some bestseller lists. It's on its 3rd printing and still sells modestly. I'm working on a 2nd book, a novel about Custer, and I have a computer full of odds and ends, essays and ramblings that I may or may not ever get published. It doesn't matter. I'm expressing my creative side in a way I never did before. Morin and I fell deeper in love, and 8 months after we met, we were married in a small ceremony in Durango. Laura came out for the wedding, and she and Morin became friendly. Laura was promoted to manager of the store where she'd been working and seems to be doing well. A year ago, I was blessed with another child when Morin delivered a baby boy. You cannot fathom how much I appreciate a second chance at fatherhood. Beth hasn't remarried, although she does date some. She's filled her life with working on seriously fixing up the house, which gives her something to occupy her time when she's not working. We've stayed friends and still talk occasionally, mostly about what to do with Jason. His commitment to sobriety didn't take, and he fell deeper into the spell of drugs. He's currently incarcerated after being convicted of manufacturing meth for sale with his old roomies. Our relationship blows hot and cold, but at least we have one. There are those who say adultery is a devastating thing that destroys lives, and I guess in one sense that may be true. It certainly destroyed my old life, but out of the bitter ashes of that cheating came a new, far better life for me. I'm living the life I always dreamed about when I was growing up, in a place where I always wanted to be. That would not have happened had I stayed married to Beth. She did me a favor when she started cheating on me, and as a result, I was liberated to follow my own path. The best revenge is living well, and I'm living a pretty darn good life because of my ex-wife and her lover. Thanks, guys. I needed that. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.